You're standing at the edge of a hole in the ground. It's not a big hole, just big enough for a body. The sun is going down somewhere behind you, painting the sky in colors that nobody has a name for yet. The person in the hole used to be your mother, or your brother, or the man who knew where the river bent and the fish were always thick in the spring. And now, he's just weight, just stillness, just something the earth is about to take back. And then someone starts talking. Not to the group, not to the sky in any abstract way. Directly to the dead man. Words aimed at a person who cannot hear them, cannot respond, cannot do anything at all except lie there in the cold ground while the light fails and the animals start moving in the dark beyond the tree line. This is one of the oldest things humans ever did. Not fire, not tools, not agriculture or language or any of the civilizational achievements we put on posters. Talking to the dead might be one of the first truly human behaviors we have physical evidence for. And for a very long time, nobody asked the obvious question. Not why did ancient people believe in an afterlife? Not why did they perform burial rituals? But the specific, strange, slightly uncomfortable question underneath all of that. Why did they talk? Why direct words at something that cannot receive them? Why treat a body like a person who is still somehow there? The easy answer is religion. They believed in spirits. They thought the dead could hear. They were wrong, and we're not, and that's the whole story. Close the book. But that answer is lazy, and it turns out to be spectacularly wrong in ways that should change how you think about your own mind. Because the more researchers have dug into this, literally and figuratively, across archaeology and cognitive science and evolutionary biology, the stranger and more fascinating the picture becomes. This isn't a story about ancient superstition. This is a story about what kind of machine the human brain actually is, what it was built to do, and why that hardware, the exact cognitive architecture that let our ancestors survive long enough to become us, produces something that looks, from the outside, a lot like talking to the dead. By the end of this, you'll understand why you do it too. You probably just haven't called it that yet. The oldest confirmed burial we know about happened roughly 130,000 years ago. Not by modern humans, by Neanderthals. In a cave in Shanidar, in what is now northern Iraq, archaeologists excavated a series of bodies arranged in ways that stopped them cold. Not dumped, not abandoned, placed. Positioned on their sides, knees drawn up, heads resting in specific orientations. And around one of the bodies, pollen. Enormous concentrations of flower pollen from at least 8 different plant species, several of which have known medicinal properties. Someone brought flowers to a grave 130,000 years ago. Now, scientists have debated the flower pollen finding for decades. Some argue it could have been carried in by burrowing rodents. Fair point. Science should be skeptical. But the body positioning is harder to explain away. And Shanidar is not alone. Across Europe and the Middle East, Neanderthal burial sites show the same pattern. Bodies oriented deliberately, objects placed nearby. Evidence of care that goes far beyond what you need to do with a corpse for purely sanitary reasons. You don't need to curl someone on their side and face them toward the sunrise to deal with decomposition. You do that because it means something. Then, modern humans arrive in the archaeological record, and the burials get more elaborate by an order of magnitude. At Sungir in Russia, dating to around 34,000 years ago, researchers found 2 children buried head to head, covered from skull to foot in thousands of hand-sewn mammoth ivory beads. The calculation to produce those beads alone runs to somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 hours of labor. Someone spent months, possibly years, making grave goods for children. Not tools, not weapons, beads. Beauty placed in the ground with the dead. At sites across the ancient world, the pattern repeats with variations. Food placed in graves, the dead buried with the tools of their trade, bodies painted with red ochre, the same pigment used by the living for decoration and ceremony. In some sites, the skulls of ancestors were removed, preserved separately, and kept in living spaces for generations. Not hidden away, kept close, consulted. That last detail is the one that should make you pause. Consulted. Because what that tells us is that the relationship did not end at death. The dead remained participants in the community. They kept a social role. They were still, in some functional sense that the living clearly believed and acted on, present. The question is why a brain capable of understanding death would simultaneously refuse to accept what death actually means. Here is the uncomfortable truth about your brain. It was not built for accuracy. It was built for survival. And those two things are not the same. Consider what your mind has to do just to get through a normal day. Track which people around you can be trusted. Model what your friend meant by that comment. Predict what your boss is likely to do if you miss the deadline. Anticipate whether the stranger walking toward you has good intentions or bad ones. Your brain is running a continuous, exhausting, extraordinarily sophisticated simulation of other people's minds. What they want, what they know, what they're likely to do next. Cognitive scientists call this theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others. To understand that other people have beliefs, desires, and intentions that are different from your own. This is one of the things that makes humans unusual. Most animals have limited versions of it. We have an almost absurdly powerful one. And it almost certainly evolved because, in a social species, reading other minds correctly was the difference between cooperation and betrayal, between alliance and isolation, between surviving the winter and not. But here is the problem. Here is the bug in the system that nobody designed and nobody planned for. Theory of mind has no off switch. Your brain learns to model a person over years of interaction. It builds a detailed internal simulation of who they are, how they think, what they would say in a given situation. And then that person dies. And the model doesn't disappear. It can't. There is no neurological delete button. The simulation keeps running on empty. You find yourself thinking about what they would think of something that just happened. You catch yourself about to tell them a joke. You hear a song they loved and the model fires up automatically, fully formed, present in a way that feels less like memory and more like company. This is not weakness. This is not pathology. This is your brain doing exactly what it was built to do, applied to a situation evolution never prepared it for. Researchers call this agent detection, the tendency to perceive minds and intentions behind events, behind patterns, behind things that move or change or affect us. It runs constantly in the background. It is almost impossible to turn off deliberately. Studies show that people perceive faces in static, hear voices in white noise, attribute intention to bouncing geometric shapes on a screen. We are meaning-making machines running at full power all the time. And when someone we built a years-long mental model of suddenly stops responding, the model doesn't conclude they're gone. It concludes they're somewhere else. Still present, just not answering right now. Talking to the dead is not a failure of reason. It is reason, applied by a brain that was never designed to accept that some conversations are truly over. So the brain keeps the model running. But that still doesn't fully explain the talking, because there's a difference between privately feeling like someone is still present and actually directing words at them out loud in front of others as a group with specific rituals attached. That leap from internal experience to external social practice is where things get genuinely interesting. Start with knowledge transfer. For the vast majority of human history, there were no libraries, no written records, no institutions. Everything a community knew about where the water was in drought season, about which plants healed and which ones killed, about the location of safe passes through the mountains, lived inside human heads. And when those heads stopped working, that knowledge was in serious danger of disappearing forever. Talking to the dead, formally, ritually, in front of the whole group, was one solution to that problem. You invoke the ancestor. You ask what they knew. You reconstruct their wisdom through the act of address. The dead become a living archive, maintained through ceremony. The ritual of consultation kept critical knowledge socially active across generations. in a world where forgetting could be fatal. Then there is grief. Raw, destabilizing, functionally debilitating grief. A hunter who cannot focus gets people killed. A mother, too paralyzed by loss to gather food, starves her children. Grief is cognitively expensive in an environment where cognitive resources are already stretched to their limit. Cultures that developed structured ways to process grief, set periods of mourning, specific words to say, specific places to say them, had a measurable practical advantage over cultures that didn't. The ritual of speaking to the dead gives grief somewhere to go. It provides a container, a form, a beginning and an end to the process of letting someone who is gone become someone who is remembered. And then there is the deepest function of all, social cohesion. Shared rituals, synchronized groups. When an entire community participates in the same ceremony, speaks the same words, performs the same gestures toward the same dead, something happens neurologically that is well documented in modern research. Trust increases. Group identity strengthens. The sense of shared fate, shared history, shared obligation to one another deepens in ways that make cooperation more likely and defection less likely. The dead, in other words, were doing work. Active, essential, community-sustaining work. Every culture on Earth independently arrived at some version of this practice because every culture on Earth faced the same problems: loss, memory, cohesion, meaning. That is not superstition. That is engineering, just built from ceremony instead of stone. Here is what nobody tells you about talking to the dead. It never stopped. We did not evolve out of it. We did not reason our way past it. We did not build enough science or accumulate enough education to make it go away. We just changed the vocabulary. We visit graves and stand there in silence, and everyone understands that the silence is directed at someone specific. We write letters to people who died years ago and never send them, because there is nowhere to send them. We sit in cars in parking lots and say out loud the thing we never got to say. We light candles. We pour drinks for empty chairs. We hold funerals where the entire point is to speak to a person who cannot hear us, in front of everyone we know. And somehow that speaking does something real, something measurable, something that helps. Psychologists have a term for it now: continuing bonds theory. The idea that healthy grief does not require severing the relationship with the dead, but rather transforming it. Maintaining an ongoing internal connection with someone who is gone is not a failure to accept reality. It is, according to a substantial body of clinical research, actually associated with better long-term outcomes than forced emotional severance. The people who talk to their dead mother while cooking the recipe she taught them are not stuck. They are doing something ancient and adaptive and deeply sane. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you for a second. Every single cognitive mechanism that produced those Neanderthal burials, that filled Sungir with mammoth ivory beads, that kept ancestor skulls in the living spaces of prehistoric communities, is still running inside your skull right now, unchanged. The theory of mind that cannot accept a permanent silence. The agent detection that keeps the model running after the person is gone. The social architecture that processes loss through ritual and address. You have the same hardware. You are running the same software. The gap between you and the person who placed flowers in a cave 130,000 years ago is not as wide as you have been assuming. So why did ancient humans talk to the dead? Because they were human. Because their brains worked exactly like yours does. Because the people they lost mattered too much to simply stop mattering. Because some part of the mind that learned to love someone does not know how to unlearn it, and maybe was never supposed to. The oldest thing about us turns out to be one of the most recognizable. You already knew how to do this. You probably already have.